My name is Michael Graves. But in the world I speak from, names are never the whole story. Before his mind began slipping into fog, my father left behind something unexpected. A small, leather-bound diary with worn edges, a cracked spine, and pages filled with ink that had faded into a deep brown. He gave it to me before memory began taking pieces of him away, and he said only one thing. One day, someone needs to know what these stories really cost. He never spoke much about his past, but everyone in our family understood the silence around him, the late-night phone calls, the unmarked folders he kept locked away, the way he watched rooms before entering them. For 25 years he worked in places most people never see, rooms without windows, offices where conversations were never written down, meetings that didn't exist on schedules. My entire childhood I only ever saw fragments of who he had been, but the diary was different. Inside were names, warnings, and stories, some public, some buried, and some whispered only among people who used aliases more often than real identities. He wrote about the ones who crossed lines, the ones who disappeared, the ones who played both sides, and the ones who believed they were too clever to ever get caught. And there was one name he underlined twice in red, a man who wasn't supposed to be a threat, a man trusted with secrets at the highest levels, a man whose betrayal helped destroy operations, expose informants, and shake the foundations of American intelligence. His name was Robert Philip Hanssen. You may think you know his story from the headlines, the documentaries, and the podcasts, but the pages in that diary told a version far colder, far stranger, and far more unsettling than the one the public ever heard. Today, I am opening that page, because some stories aren't just history, they are warnings. And if what you are hearing already feels shocking, stay with me. Because the final part of this story, the part my father circled and wrote, "Do not forget," is the reason Hanssen's betrayal was unlike anything the FBI had ever seen. We start not in Washington, and not inside the FBI's marble hallways, but in Moscow in the mid-1980s. Two men, both Soviet officers who had secretly agreed to work for the United States, were quietly doing their jobs in the shadows. Their names were Valery Martinov and Sergei Motorin. For years, they passed along information that helped Washington understand what was really happening inside the KGB, who was moving where, which operations were being planned, and how the Soviet machine really worked when the propaganda was stripped away. Then, suddenly, something changed. They were called back to Moscow. On paper, it was just a routine recall. To people who had done this work long enough, it felt wrong. But they went. That is what loyalty meant. They were arrested, interrogated, crushed in the gears of their own system, and eventually executed with a bullet to the head. It was the classic signature punishment for traitors. For the CIA and FBI, this was not just a tragedy. It was a signal flare in the dark. Around the same time, other assets, people the CIA and FBI had spent years recruiting and protecting, began to go dark. Some simply stopped communicating. Others disappeared into prisons. Some turned up in show trials. Something was very wrong, and it clearly was not just bad luck inside the Bureau. They did what they always do when this kind of pattern appears. They formed a task force. Experienced analysts, Soviet specialists, and counterintelligence veterans sat together in a room and began to go through report after report, debrief after debrief, trying to find a thread. They looked for anything. A date that did not fit. A travel pattern that overlapped. A small coincidence that could point to a mole. On one level, the situation seemed very simple. We know our agents are being exposed, which means someone on our side is leaking. But as the months and then years passed without a clear answer, something uncomfortable began to happen. The idea that the traitor might be inside the FBI itself, inside the very unit hunting the leak, was so disturbing that most people just did not want to stare at it. It hung in the background, like a bad smell nobody wanted to acknowledge. If you think that is already bad, wait until you see how close they came to blaming the wrong man, while the real spy walked right past their desks every morning. To understand how that could happen, we need to step far away from Foxstone Park and dead drops and go back decades to Chicago, April 18th, 1944. That's where Robert Hanssen was born. On the surface, his family looked like a classic American story. A father who'd served in the Navy during World War II and later became a Chicago police officer, and a mother who stayed home, raised their only child, and kept the house in order. They were working class, Christian, respectable, the kind of family you'd picture in a black and white photo framed in a hallway. But behind the front door, things were different. His father, Howard, wasn't just strict. He was relentless. He used harsh punishments, constant criticism, and a stream of belittling comments to toughen up his son. Those punishments weren't about discipline. They were about humiliation. Experiences like that don't automatically create a traitor, but they do plant something deep. The belief that you are never good enough, that you're constantly being judged and found lacking, and that somewhere, somehow, you need to prove yourself in a way that no one can deny. As a teenager, Hanssen was quiet, serious, a bit awkward, tall, often dressed in dark clothes. Not the charismatic guy who filled the room with energy, but the observer who sat slightly apart, studying everything in college. He studied chemistry and also took Russian, an interesting choice in the middle of the Cold War. He met Bonnie, a young woman from a devout Catholic family with ties to Opus Dei, a conservative Catholic organization. Eventually, he converted to Catholicism and threw himself into it. He attended Mass regularly, joined religious activities, and talked about morality and sin. On paper, he was exactly the man you'd want carrying a badge. Educated, religious, disciplined, and coming from a police family. He tried dentistry for a while but dropped out, feeling drawn back toward law enforcement like his father. He worked in the Chicago Police Department, becoming involved in internal affairs and forensic accounting. Then, in 1976, he joined the FBI. For a man with his background, that was the dream job. A chance to stand at the front line of national security. But there was a problem. To him, much of the work felt dull and bureaucratic. He felt overlooked, underappreciated, and intellectually superior to many around him. At home, he and Bonnie were starting a family. Private Catholic schools, a decent house, and the life he believed he deserved cost more money than a federal salary could easily provide. You might think a man like this Catholic, family man, law and order background would be nearly impossible to turn. In reality, those same things helped hide him. He could look his colleagues in the eye and talk about patriotism, duty, and God, while secretly telling himself that what he was doing in the shadows was manageable, controlled, maybe even justified. And in a way, his first step into treason really did look small, which is exactly what made it so dangerous. By the late 1970s, Hanssen is settled into FBI life. He's known as someone who's smart with numbers and computers, good at tracking money and understanding systems. He's handling cases involving financial crime and, later, matters related to Soviet intelligence. But inside, he's restless. He wants more responsibility, more respect, more proof that he's the smartest man in the room. At home, the bills are mounting. He and Bonnie have children, and the cost of private Catholic school, a mortgage, and the image he wants to project is heavy. Somewhere between frustration and ambition, he makes a decision that will change everything. In 1979, in New York, there's a Soviet trade organization, an office everyone in counterintelligence knows is crawling with KGB and GRU officers. Hanssen knows something important. Nobody is watching the front door all the time. One day, he simply walks into the building, not as a rival agent, not as part of an FBI operation, but as a volunteer for the other side. He hands over a letter addressed to Soviet military intelligence, the GRU, offering his services. In that letter, he doesn't give his real name. He doesn't suggest in-person meetings. He wants to operate purely through the shadows, in exchange for money. This begins the first phase of his espionage, running roughly from 1979 to 1981. During this time, he hands over information that is already deeply damaging. He warns the Soviets that the FBI has bugged certain facilities in New York used by their officials. He shares sensitive details that allow them to adjust their behavior and avoid surveillance, compromising operations the Bureau has spent years building. The worst blow in this early phase involves a man named Dmitry Polyakov, a GRU general, who had secretly spied for the United States for decades. This source, one of the CIA and FBI's crown jewels, provided invaluable insight into Soviet military thinking. When Polyakov is eventually compromised and executed by the Soviets, multiple factors play a role, but Hanssen's leaks helped put him in mortal danger. For this early treachery, Hanssen earns roughly $20,000. Not life-changing money, but enough to feel a rush, enough to feel like the game is working. At home, though, the mask almost slips. One night, Bonnie finds him in the basement, writing a letter in secret. Because of his past infidelity, she has reason to be suspicious. She presses him and eventually gets a look at the letter. It's not to another woman. It's to the Russians. He admits he's been sending information to the Soviets, but insists he's only feeding them useless material, nothing that really hurts the U.S. That's a lie, but it's the story he clings to. Horrified, Bonnie insists they speak to their priest. The priest, according to later accounts, tells him to stop spying, cut all contact, and donate any money he's earned to charity. There's no proof he ever turned over all that money. But one thing is clear. Around 1981, he pauses. Officially, he goes back to normal FBI life. No letters, no contacts, no cash from Moscow. But he's crossed the line now. He's learned that he can betray his own agency and walk away without getting caught. Once someone has stepped over that line and survived, crossing it again becomes much easier. For about 5 years, Hanssen appears to be living a conventional FBI life again. He's promoted, moves through assignments, and on the surface, nothing looks out of place. But by 1985, the Cold War is heating up again. The Soviets are in Afghanistan. Proxy conflicts are burning in different parts of the world. U.S. intelligence is still losing assets in ways that don't fully make sense. At the same time, inside Hanssen, the familiar cocktail is building again. Boredom, resentment, a belief that he's smarter than his bosses, and a constant pressure to provide for his large family and his desired lifestyle. This time, he doesn't walk into a front company in New York. Instead, he writes a letter to a minor KGB officer in Virginia, someone he thinks isn't under tight surveillance. Inside that letter is another, addressed to a senior KGB handler, Viktor Cherkashin, one of the most respected Soviet spy masters in Washington. In this communication, he introduces himself under a false name, Ramon Garcia. To prove he's for real, he offers something nobody could fake. He identifies 3 Russian men who have secretly been working as informants for U.S. intelligence: Boris Yuzhin, Sergei Motorin, and Valery Martinov. The same Martinov whose execution we mentioned earlier. All 3 are eventually arrested. Martinov and Motorin are tried and executed in the Soviet Union. Yuzhin spends years in a gulag. One letter, under a false name, kills careers, lives, and operations the U.S. spent years building. In that same communication, Hanssen also lays out the structure he wants for this new relationship. He will remain anonymous. They will never meet him face to face. All contact will happen through dead drops and carefully prepared signals. Pieces of tape in specific places, markings on signs, hidden packages under bridges and in wooded parks. He wants to be paid partly in cash, partly in diamonds, and he wants the option of eventual exfiltration to Russia, with money set aside for him in case things go wrong. Over the next 6 years of this second phase, working as Ramon Garcia, he hands over more than 6,000 pages of classified documents and multiple discs and tapes. He reveals details of U.S. nuclear war plans and the continuity of government program designed to keep the government running after a nuclear strike. He exposes a hugely expensive FBI project to dig a secret tunnel under the Soviet embassy, designed to allow listening devices to be planted beneath the building. That tunnel never produces a scrap of valuable intelligence, largely because the Soviets know about it. He also compromises technical tracking systems the FBI uses, allowing Soviet officers to adapt and evade surveillance. In return, he receives around $600,000 in cash and diamonds, with more supposedly held for him overseas. It's a lot of money for an FBI agent, but still far less than the value of what he provides. Meanwhile, his private life takes a darker turn. Behind the public facade of the church-going, Opus Dei Catholic husband and father, he shows a deeply voyeuristic and exhibitionist side. He involves his best friend in deeply inappropriate situations with his wife. Later, he begins a strange patron relationship with a stripper, showering her with gifts, a car, and travel, apparently funded with his spy money, all while telling himself and others that he remains a man of faith. The contradiction between his public persona and private actions grows more extreme. By 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. The KGB is broken up. Structures are changing. The world he's dealing with becomes unstable. For a while, he goes quiet. He stops communicating with his handlers. Once again, it looks like he might simply fade back into ordinary life, but the damage he's already done will continue to ripple for years, and the story is not over. Even after the Cold War ends, and some famous traitors like Aldrich Ames are caught and imprisoned, something still doesn't add up, for American intelligence operations are still being exposed and collapsing. Agents are still disappearing, even in cases where Ames couldn't have been responsible. That means one thing. There has to be another leak, a second mole inside the system. In the mid-1990s, the CIA and FBI form a joint task force to hunt this shadow. They draw up lists of everyone who had access to certain compromised cases. They look at movements, assignments, timing, and try to construct a profile of who it might be. Their attention, once again, focuses mostly on the CIA. One name that rises to the surface is Brian Kelly, a loyal CIA case officer with a strong record who happens to have connections to some of the operations that have been blown. From the outside, the theory looks plausible. Under pressure to show progress, investigators zero in on Kelly. He finds himself under constant surveillance. He's interrogated repeatedly, suspended from his duties, and his career and reputation begin to crumble. At home, the stress is enormous. He has no idea what evidence they think they have against him, and no way to prove a negative that he did not betray his country. The truth, though, is simple. Brian Kelly is innocent. While he's being treated as the prime suspect, the real mole is sitting in the FBI, working cases, going to mass, and living in the same comfortable suburban world as some of the people investigating the leaks. Around this time, American agencies try a different approach. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, many former KGB officers are out of work and struggling. Some of them, for the right price, are willing to talk. The FBI and CIA quietly offer substantial sums to any ex-KGB officers willing to provide information on past operations and assets. Eventually, they meet one who has something extraordinary, a dossier on an American mole who had worked for the KGB. The package contains copies of letters the mole sent over the years, operational notes, and even an audio tape of a phone conversation between the mole and his handler. The FBI pays a lot of money for this file and rushes it back to be translated and analyzed. When they play the tape, it becomes immediately clear that the voice on it is not Brian Kelly's. That alone should have been enough to fully clear him, but years of suspicion don't disappear. Overnight, analysts start reading through the letters more carefully. One FBI agent notices a particular way the mole uses a derogatory term for the Japanese, a phrase that was more common in an older generation. Another letter mentions a detail about Chicago, specifically an old reference to Mayor Richard Daley. To many people, those would be just meaningless quirks. But to someone who has spent years sharing a cubicle, listening to office small talk, and hearing someone's casual comments, those details ring a bell. The agent realizes he knows a man who talks like that, who has that combination of background and attitude. The puzzle pieces snap into place. The fingerprints lifted from one of the items in the dossier confirm it. The mole is not a CIA officer. He's an FBI veteran, Robert Philip Hanssen. Quietly, in a small circle at FBI headquarters, a new, terrifying reality sinks in. For years, the Bureau thought it was helping the CIA find their traitor. In reality, the worst traitor of all was one of their own. Now, they had a name. But they still needed the most important thing: a way to catch him in the act, without letting him know he was under suspicion. By the late 1990s, Hanssen believes he's gotten away with it. He's older, approaching the mandatory retirement age. He's in Washington, trusted, and known as a serious, if somewhat odd, professional. On the surface, he's just another gray man in a gray suit. Behind the scenes, he's testing the waters again. After a long break, he reestablishes contact with Russian intelligence, now dealing with the SVR, one of the KGB's successor agencies. Once again, he uses the alias Ramon Garcia. Once again, he sets up dead drops and coded signals, careful timings and secret exchanges in parks and quiet corners of the city. He knows enough about FBI systems to search for any sign that someone might be connecting dots around him. He combs through internal databases for his own name, his old addresses, known dead drop locations, and anything that could expose him. He finds nothing. That's because the investigation that matters most isn't being run through those systems. It's being run on paper, in a tightly controlled circle, precisely so that someone like him won't see it. Once the Bureau is sure Hanssen is their mole, they have to decide what to do next. If they arrest him right away, they may miss the full scope of the damage, or lose the chance to get solid proof of ongoing espionage. If they let him keep spying too long, he could expose even more operations and assets. They choose a middle path. They decide to bring him closer, into a controlled environment where they can watch everything. That's when he gets called into an office and offered what looks like a late career dream. A new job at FBI headquarters, a special role in computer security, a promotion into the senior executive service. For a man who's always believed he deserved more recognition, this feels like long overdue validation he accepts. His new office at headquarters is not a normal workspace. It's a set piece. The room and the surrounding areas are wired with hidden cameras and microphones. Access is controlled. His new assistant is not just a regular staffer. He's a young man named Eric O'Neill, experienced in surveillance, brought in specifically to shadow Hanssen, learn his habits, gain his trust, and seize opportunities. Hanssen has one object he treats almost like a part of his body. A small handheld device, a Palm Pilot. On it, he stores notes and information he believes no one can access. He's proud of the encryption and tells people, with some satisfaction, that not even the FBI could break it. The investigators know that if they can get inside that device, they'll have a roadmap to his contacts and plans. So they set up a small trap that feels like an ordinary workplace moment. One day, some colleagues challenge Hanssen to a shooting contest at the FBI's underground range. They flatter his skills as a marksman, throw a little bet on the table, and draw him out of the office. While he's downstairs firing rounds at targets, O'Neill and the tech team race into his office. They grab the Palm Pilot, a disk, and a memory card, get them to the technicians, and copy everything as quickly as possible. Then they return everything to exactly where it was before Hanssen comes back. Inside that data, they find what they were hoping for. Letters, notes, and crucially, the date and location of his next planned dead drop with Russian intelligence. The chosen site is a small park in Vienna, Virginia, not far from his home, Foxstone Park. The drop location is under a small footbridge at a spot he and his handler have used before they call the site Ellis. The FBI prepares for a full-scale operation. Surveillance teams in unmarked cars, SWAT units staged nearby, technical teams ready to record every second. On February 18, 2001, Hanssen drives as usual. He drops off his longtime friend at the airport, as he often does. Then, instead of heading straight home, he swings into Foxstone Park agent's watch as he parks his car, opens the trunk, and prepares a package wrapped in plastic and a garbage bag. Inside are classified documents and a letter to his handlers. He walks into the park alone, as he's done many times before, and places a small strip of white tape on a sign, his signal that a package is in position. Then he goes to the underside of the wooden footbridge and tucks the bag into a hidden spot. From his perspective, it's just another dead drop in a quiet suburban park. The sound of his footsteps on the path, a few trees, a little wooden bridge, nothing extraordinary. From the FBI's perspective, this is the moment they've been waiting for. As he walks back toward his car, the order goes out. SUVs rush and armed agents surround him. Within seconds, he's on the ground, being handcuffed. Different accounts remember different words, but the quotes that have circulated ever since are chilling. Some say he asked, "What took you so long?" Others recall him saying, "So this is how it ends." Either way, after decades of damage, the FBI's worst traitor is finally in custody. For the Bureau, the arrest is a relief and a humiliation at the same time. For Hanssen, it's the end of the game he thought he was winning. After the arrest, the legal process unfolds quickly. Hanssen is charged with multiple counts of espionage and conspiracy. The evidence is overwhelming. They have his letters, his fingerprints, his encrypted data, his dead drops, the documents he prepared, and the eyewitness surveillance. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, and knowing he can't beat the case, he agrees to plead guilty. In exchange for avoiding execution, he accepts a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole on 15 counts of espionage and related charges. He also agrees to cooperate in debriefings, telling investigators what he did and what he exposed. He is sent to ADX Florence, the supermax federal prison in Colorado, designed to hold some of the most dangerous inmates in the system. There, he spends 23 hours a day in a concrete cell, alone. His bed is concrete. His world is narrowed to a small space and the few books he's allowed to read. His contact with other people is minimal. It is a kind of slow-motion burial. He will live like that for more than 2 decades, until his death in 2023 at the age of 79. For the FBI and the U.S. intelligence community, though, locking him away is only part of the story. They need to understand what happened. How did this man stay hidden for so long? How did he slip through internal controls again and again? How did he manage to sit at the center of sensitive operations in the heart of the Bureau while feeding secrets to Moscow? Psychologists and psychiatrists are brought in to interview him to try to understand his motivations and his mind. What emerges is a picture of a man with deep feelings of inadequacy, rooted partly in his childhood. A father who humiliated him and made him feel small, and a lifelong craving to prove himself superior, especially intellectually. On top of that, he developed an enormous ego. He believed he was the smartest man in most rooms he walked into. That combination, low self-worth and extreme arrogance, is dangerous. Money was certainly a factor. Supporting 6 children in private Catholic schools and maintaining a certain standard of living on a government salary is hard. The Russians paid him roughly $600,000 in cash and diamonds, with hundreds of thousands more put aside for him abroad. But that still doesn't fully explain his choices, given the scale of the damage. There was something else, the thrill of outsmarting the system. He seemed to enjoy the idea that he could manipulate the very institution that trusted him, staying one step ahead, playing both sides. In his own mind, he often tried to soften what he had done. He told himself he had controlled the damage, that he had sometimes limited the information he gave, that he wasn't as destructive as he could have been. The reality is brutally different. Multiple informants he exposed were arrested and executed. Operations that cost millions of dollars were compromised. Some of the most sensitive contingency plans the U.S. had in case of nuclear war were handed over to an adversary. A special commission led by former FBI and CIA Director William Webster later concludes that Hanssen's espionage represents one of the worst intelligence disasters in U.S. history. The commission points to serious security failures, lax internal monitoring, over-reliance on personal trust, and a lack of robust systems to detect unusual access patterns or unexplained money reforms follow. More thorough background checks, closer monitoring of computer systems, and more frequent polygraph tests for senior officials. But none of that can bring back the people who died because of his actions or repair the networks he helped destroy. The human fallout extends beyond the intelligence world, too. Brian Kelly, the innocent CIA officer who spent years under suspicion, is eventually cleared and reinstated after Hanssen's arrest. But the damage to his health, reputation, and family life is deep. He dies in 2011, with his loved ones believing that the stress of being wrongly targeted as a traitor contributed to his death. On one side, you have Hanssen, spending his remaining years in concrete isolation, reading and praying. On the other side, you have a trail of people and institutions trying to rebuild from the wreckage he left behind. Let's go back one more time to that leather-bound diary my father gave me. It was written by a man who spent a quarter of a century in a world where trust is measured in inches and betrayal is always a possibility. Before his memory began to fade, he told me something about moles like Hanssen. He said, "You never start by asking, could this person be a traitor? You start by asking, where would a traitor feel the safest?" For years, Robert Hanssen felt safest inside the very institution built to stop people like him. He blended in among the suits and the rituals. He went to church, talked about God and morality, carried a rosary, and then went back to his office and quietly opened the doors of his own house to the enemy. His story isn't just about one man's betrayal. It's about how an organization can be blindest where it feels most secure. The FBI believed its biggest danger came from outside, foreign agents trying to break in. But the most dangerous man of all was already inside, with a badge, a gun, and access to the deepest secrets. There is no neat moral, no clean good versus evil conclusion. Here Hanssen hurt his country, his co-workers, his wife and children, and the people who trusted him spiritually. He damaged the image of the faith he claimed to live by, and he fed an adversary information that could have been catastrophic in a different set of circumstances. And yet, in his own mind, he often told himself he was still in control, that he could have done worse, that he somehow remained, on some twisted level, a patriot. That's the scariest part. The moment someone starts believing they are too smart to get caught, too important to be questioned, too clever to leave a trail, that's the moment they're already halfway toward becoming the danger they once swore to fight. In my father's diary, next to Hanssen's name, he didn't write a long essay. He wrote one short line and underlined it twice in red. Never assume the enemy is outside the room. If this story has opened your eyes to how espionage really works behind the headlines, share this video with someone who still thinks spies only exist in movies. If you want to turn more pages from my father's diary, more names, more operations, more red underlines, make sure you subscribe. Because the next name in that book might be even more shocking than this one.